Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the Körber History Forum. It's a bit of an early start this morning. We are hoping for some more guests to arrive. After last night's opening focused on the experiences and legacies of 1989 in terms of security politics and news and old orders, this morning is about 1989 and the value of Europe. So based on the values, based on the transformation and experiences of transformation in Central and Eastern Europe, which values will hold Europe, the European project, together in the future? That is what we are going to talk about this morning. We are very honored to be able to welcome as speaker and discussant Bronisław Komorowski, the former President of the Republic of Poland between 2010 and 2015. Mr. President, a warm welcome to you this morning. So, Mr. Komorowski was not only the President of the Republic of Poland, but also he himself is a historian and an active member of the anti-communist Polish protest movement, Solidarność, in the 1980s. So you are both an eyewitness and a policymaker. After a short input by the President, we have a talk on stage moderated by Thomas Paulsen and followed by a Q&A with the audience. We have two colleagues with microphones who will be heading to you if you want to ask questions. One housekeeping remark. Mr. President Komorowski will speak in Polish. So everybody who is not able to understand or to master Polish and who does not have yet a translation device, please make sure you get one. And now we are interested in answers to the question, what is the value of Europe? Mr. President, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Szanowni Państwo, pragnę przede wszystkim.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you first of all for the invitation to Berlin, and I hope that what I want to say today will fit this site, and with the experience of Berlin and Germany and the experience of the Poles. Ladies and gentlemen, it is meanwhile 20 years ago that the Central and Eastern European countries joined NATO, and 15 years have passed since these countries joined the European Union, and this was made possible by the collapse of the communist system, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and regaining the right to self-determination by the countries of this region. And for us, this is a process. And this was a break with the communist system, and also brought about by the massive resistance in Poland within the framework of the Solidarność movement until the membership of the EU. We're celebrating these anniversaries, which are important for us, knowing full well that the European project is currently facing serious crises. And this is not just about the Euro's economic crisis, which has not been completely overcome yet. It should be remembered that Poland was the only EU country where economic development did not falter. So in other words, we didn't have a crisis. And because we also have the Brexit and the migration crisis, which is why it's just got a little quiet about this. And then there's the aggressive action of Russia towards Georgia and Ukraine, i.e. those countries that are seeking rapprochement with the West. So among the crisis phenomena are also the increasing strength and attractiveness of the anti-European political forces, populism and fundamentalism. So the enlargement of the EU and NATO to include the countries of Central and Southern Europe was a legitimate and successful step. It could rely on a strong civilizational and geopolitical foundation. So this enlargement was by no means a simple extension of both communities to the east, as the opponents of this process from the West and Russia wanted to see it. At its core, it was about the accession of the countries of this region to the process of integration of the Western world, from which we had been cut off by the unjust judgment of history, and we found ourselves on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. But this condition could not last forever, although the opponents of NATO and EU enlargement at the time put forward their counter-arguments, which had their origin in the 19th century, the time of the Congress of Vienna. These times are fortunately long gone for Europe. It was now decisive and contemporary to choose the values on which the integration of the West was based in a conscious manner. And when I say this was a legitimate step that was based on a strong foundation, and I say this because the nations of Central Europe have belonged to the same Latin civilization for over a millennium, and they played an active part in the development of European culture and have shared the good and bad experiences with Europe. When they had to stay behind the Iron Curtain, they longed to join the unifying Europe, and this right could not be denied them. In addition, this expansion was beneficial for all. I am totally convinced of that. And for the whole of Europe, it was an opportunity to overcome the experience of many years of division during the Cold War. And for Germany, it was also an opportunity to unite internally and nationally. For the former communist countries, this meant that they could consolidate their regained sovereignty and seize the opportunity to catch up in the economy, because life in a real socialist economy brought something for everyone. This is the expansion of the common market. So the fact that there were problems with Russia is due to the fact that even after the end of the Cold War, we gave Moscow the feeling and let the dreams grow that despite the collapse of the communist bloc and the fall of the Iron Curtain, we still lived in times of the great power concert, as in times of the Vienna Congress. There was a conviction that Russia had the right to its own sphere of influence and the right to decide on the shape of a united Europe or on the security of the West. So we need a dialogue with Russia. And nobody knows it better than the Poles and the Germans, but this dialogue must not be at the expense of the rights of the smaller countries in its neighborhood. However, we cannot accept that Moscow should intimidate us and that we should be subject to that intimidation, because that would mean the end of the alliance and the union. It would be a denial of the foundation of values that forms the basis of NATO and the European Union. Today's crises have their origin, above all, in our present weaknesses and mistakes, and not in the decisions taken in the 1990s. This applies to both crises and disturbing phenomena from the point of view of Western cohesion and credibility at national level and within our two communities. As a rule, internal problems caused by the authorities of individual countries are transferred to community level. So we see it precisely in the example of the European Union, but sometimes the EU can neither meet the legitimate expectations of its members nor cope with the fears of its societies. So this naturally raises the question of consistency and attachment to European values. This question arises especially in those countries where we can observe the increasing presence and strength of populist, nationalist and anti-democratic parties, and where we see attempts to transform democratic institutions in such a way that they just become a mere shell or dummy of what they were to represent. To some extent, this also concerns Poland, especially its current authorities. So we feel that Europe is at a crossroads, that discernible changes within generations and in their attitudes have put on the agenda a discussion about the desired political system and the shaping of the European Union. And that many Eurosceptic forces have emerged in public life, spreading ideas of non-liberal democracy or questioning the principles of economic freedom as levers of development. So we feel that crisis phenomena are increasing. But I personally do not believe that this is already a crisis of values and that the values are losing their relevance. It's not a crisis of the framework of values on which Europe is built. Although we must not forget that there's always, and in every society, a certain percentage of people who are suspicious of freedom, liberalism, openness and democracy. It's difficult for us to link universal values, including those enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty, with the natural need to strengthen the identity of each individual or nation. As soon as a threat to the identity emerges, and as soon as this threat is misinterpreted, or the general values are misrepresented, these values are seen as the cause of the threat, and they will be called into question. So this political weapon fell into the hands of skeptics and open opponents of the progress of European integration. Proponents of strengthening integration progress must take this into account in the daily practical organization of individual member states and the EU as a whole. The Swiss historian and intellectual Reynolds once wrote that every system destroys itself by exaggerating its own principles. I believe this is a valuable thought. So when our systems do not give EU citizens a sense of economic or cultural security through unreasonable use of freedom or openness, then the citizens will try to lock themselves in within their political and mental boundaries. There will always be someone who pretends to have recipes to solve their problems just to gain more power. A siren song sounds that misleads societies and even entire countries. And this applies not only to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. This siren song can be heard today from the Atlantic to the Baltic Sea. So as today, the idea of a return to the Europe of the fatherlands can be seen in such a siren song. That's a wrong motto because the respective European father countries are doing better today in the European Union than ever before in their history. But why does this motto emerge today? Why does it seem to be attractive? Among other things, because the EU has not managed to become an attractive and convincing European home that promotes and emphasizes the typical European value of cultural diversity. The identification and strengthening of the elements of the common pan-European foundation must be, and I believe that sincerely, be balanced by concern for the preservation of cultural diversity as a value in itself. In Poland, the term European home was used by John Paul II, and the outstanding poet Zbigniew Herbert was important for my generation. So home, however, is not just a set of values and norms or standards that is abstract or sterile. The home also means the past, the heritage, good or bad traditions, but it's a common tradition that will evoke emotions, a sense of community, of identity and destiny. This is also in the case of our continent. This is the contribution of Christianity to the building of our civilization and identity. In my opinion, the EU has not understood this need. Sometimes there's the impression that this heritage today disturbs or even depresses, that some people want to displace this heritage from the history and identity of Europe. So these are things that we have to think about. And we remember what it used to be, where Gothic is, there is Europe. Perhaps the unfortunate fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris should lead us to look favorably on the legacy of the late Middle Ages, which shaped the mature European identity. The defense of the foundation of values on which the EU is built is important, but the best defense is an effective solution to the current problems in people's lives, which no state can achieve alone. I think that concrete things best reach the imagination of the people. Therefore, for example, the abolition of telephone roaming should be acknowledged, because this has brought the European Union many enthusiasts, not only among the new and the younger generations. So if the European institutions manage to achieve similar effectiveness in solving other and similar problems, I'm not afraid for our future. Because one thing is certain, we will not be short of major problems or major challenges. And I'm thinking here of ecology, of the challenges posed by the globalization of the economy, and I think of the internet. Europeans are practical and will appreciate efficiency. I firmly believe that already in a few years' time we will see the current situation which is depressing in spring 2019, and we will regard it as part of a temporary historical phenomenon that will be called coping with Europe's crisis in the second half of the second decade of the 21st century. And with this idea, I would like to wish you interesting deliberations and discussions at this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ist okay?
Ja, Herr Präsident.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your presentation. Does translation work for you? You mentioned a number of issues regarding the value of Europe, and we are going to talk about that in our Q&A. But before we actually start our discussion, allow me to come back to our opening session we had last night, where we talked about NATO's Eastern enlargement. We had Professor Mary Sarotti here, who gave an extensive explanation who said what to whom and what was said in the context of NATO's enlargement. And she also mentioned a talk with Volker Rühr. And we just had a conversation about that this morning. We had the rare privilege that we have a true eyewitness of those years, and he's an expert in European political issues and has shaped many of the European developments. Maybe you can talk about this talk you had with Mr. Rühr about NATO's Eastern enlargement. Ladies and gentlemen, I use every opportunity to highlight the positive role of Germany and Germany's policy
regarding the decisions of NATO's enlargement. I'm firmly convinced that this was a very important moment, not only for us, but also for Germany, and it was an important step also for Europe as a whole. And that is why now we should also deal with issues to take reasonable decisions. We should support countries that are located in our eastern neighborhood. They would like to become part of the West, and here I think particularly of Ukraine. I'd like to speak about a conservation that was very important, and here I remember the early 1990s. At the time, I was in the Polish Ministry of Defense and had a senior position there. At that time, Volker Rühr came to visit us quite often, and he was a proponent and an advocate of the Eastern enlargement process of NATO. And I asked him, well, why do you as Germans support us? Because in spite of all the history and the difficulties. And Volker Rühr said, you asked the same question I get from my German friends. They also asked me, why do you want the Poles to exceed NATO? What would you say? And I said, well, look at the map. I explained to all my colleagues where the border is. We have the Oder River border between Germany and Poland. 1,000 kilometers from there, there's Poland's border to the Ukraine, to Belarus and Russia. And I usually ask the Germans, what do you think is better for Germany? A division or an operational space stretching far? That is to say, shouldn't Germany rather have a region that is close, or would you want to have in your neighborhood a region that poses a danger? So, would you rather have the danger emerging right at your doorstep, or would you rather have a zone of insecurity 1,000 kilometers away? And that was something I used as a term, as a concept, when I wanted to convince my Polish colleagues that we'd better support Ukraine's independence. I also took my colleagues to the map, and people asked me, why should we support the Ukraine? I said, look, it's the same situation. There's the Polish-Ukrainian border, 1,500 kilometers from there. There's the Ukrainian-Russian border. So what is better for us as Poles? What is more secure? So the operational space as a concept is important, whether this operational space starts at your doorstep or whether it starts beyond 1,000 kilometers away from your border. This is a concept that most people can understand, and at the same time, Eastern enlargement of NATO was not only a process to fulfill our dreams, it was also a rational calculation about what's best for countries. Not only for the countries that were trying to exceed, it was also a good solution for those that were already in NATO. Well, time ago you were active in NATO. You were arrested at the beginning of the 80s. What was your perception of the situation in Europe, in the West, in Germany? There was NATO's double decision. There was an active peace movement in the Federal Republic of Germany. Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union the empire of evil. Well, there were many people, however, who considered Ronald Reagan to be more of a danger than actually the Soviet Union. What was your impression, being in Poland at the time? I have no typical CV. I was a revolutionary, starting at the very early hours of resistance movement. Ever since 1968, I'd been involved in several forms of anti-communist underground movements. What influenced me regarding my political convictions was the following situation. When I was in an underground movement, we also issued a newspaper. We called it Adriatic Sea, Baltic Sea, Black Sea. It was a publication not only dedicated to the Polish perspective of freedom. We looked at our communities of faith. We appealed upon people not just to look at their own aspirations for freedom, but look at the neighbors as well. We were all in the same boat. That's what we said. I always lived in the conviction that I'm going to see the moment where we will be free, when a good fate is going to bind us together as a community of values and at the same time a community of interests. During the time of the Solidarność movement, there was Reagan's speech. He called indeed the Soviet Union the empire of evil, and he was absolutely right. We agreed to his opinion. Poland was a country that was not only deprived of its sovereignty. It was a country that had been forced to become part of a totalitarian system, but we were also a country with a rich potential, a rich history. And that is why our country was very well aware of the situation and was always to some degree also an adversary of the Soviet Union. It is by no means an accident that the Solidarność movement emerged in Poland, uniting millions of people. It was a phenomenon that could only develop in a country that had a profound anti-communist attitude. And so we always had the feeling we were enslaved by the Soviet Union. After we had regained our freedom in 1989, we wanted once again to become a sovereign Polish country in line with the Western world. The two big anchors that could link us to the West was the European Union and NATO, of course. The first Polish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Christophe Kuybyshevskiy, talked in the Polish Sejm, and he explained why we wanted to become members of those alliances. Christophe Kuybyshevskiy gave a number of political, economic and cultural arguments why we wanted to become part of those alliances. But what was most important was his following statement. Ever since the 18th century, Poland has been facing a choice. The choice whether we want to be European or rather would we want to look at Moscow. And so this is how Poles see the dilemma of Polish politics, either to have an integration with the West, the EU or NATO. And on the other hand, we always thought our risk would be, if we do not become members, to become a sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. This is what you also addressed in your presentation. Before we ask our audience to ask questions, let me make one more remark. Recently we had a talk with one Prime Minister of the federal state of Germany, and his keynote, we always talked about we East Europeans. That is to say, he very deliberately said that the dividing line in the minds of the people is still there, and this kind of division on the minds of the people still goes along the line of the former Iron Curtain. Is there some kind of a special identity of people in Central and Eastern Europe? I don't think so. You know, there was a major difference in the old days. Of course, we had been part of the communist system for a couple of decades. That had repercussions on the way we thought. But ever since 1989, 30 years have passed until the present day. That's more than one generation after all. So the Germans might probably be best suited to answer whether there is a mental difference. Well, of course, the former East German citizens and the West German citizens might have their kind of differences, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe still do remember the dependencies, the burdens of the old communist days. But when I look at the younger generation, I would say, I mean, for them, communism is like a fairy tale. When I talk to my children about the realities of living in a communist system, they would listen politely, they would smile mildly, they show me compassion, but they have nothing in common with this history anymore, with these days anymore. I mean, there might always be a kind of regional specificity when it comes to mindsets and outlooks. And maybe the Italians, Spaniards, or the Germans would look at European issues from different angles. And also, maybe the people in Central and Eastern Europe would have a different perspective. But I wouldn't say there are clear mental differences between East European and West European people. But of course, the experience of living in conditions of a lack of freedom, I hope very much that those times will never be completely forgotten. I think remembering those days is very important. That shows how important the values are that we can now live, how important it is to be free, and how important it is also for others to be able to enjoy freedom. The problems we have, the problems with fundamentalism, radicalism, nationalism, it's not just a problem of Central and Eastern Europe, it's a common European problem. It's a problem that concerns Germany as well. Let's come back to that. Sometimes you hear voices in Poland speaking about neo-colonialism, like for instance the Germans having a neo-colonial attitude. Obviously, some people think they do not have the same right, they're not taken as seriously as they should be. Do you think that is just a political instrumentalization, or are there indeed any valid reasons for such feelings? It's a pleasure for me to say that Germany's policy vis-à-vis Poland after 1989 has favored the development of partnership relationships between our two countries. Germany's policies also made it possible for Germany to become part of the Soviet Union and play a meaningful role within the so-called Weimar Triangle, the partnership between Germany, France and Poland. I think that is a very important perspective for the future as well. Not only as far as the potentials are concerned and not only as far as the role of Poland is concerned, within this partnership situation we can unfold our potential to integrate the West and the East in a better way. But of course, what you have mentioned, those statements are political, excessive statements. These are attempts to instrumentalize resentments that people might still have on the basis of our sometimes very difficult German-Polish history. But I think those statements do not convince people. Those are statements that would only be appealing to people who are very close to the current Polish government. This party tries to speak in two different tongues. On the one hand side, they use anti-German slogans to appeal to their electorate, but on the other hand, they need to speak the language of the Europeans and the language of an active engagement within the EU to be appealing to the European partners. Look at the surveys in Poland. The situation is paradoxical in Poland. We have a government which very often makes skeptical statements about the European Union, but 80% of the polls in surveys, in opinion polls, say they would like to have further European integration, and they also have a very positive attitude regarding the quality of German-Polish relations. That is to say, politicians use the old stereotypes. They have revitalized the stereotypes, but most Poles would like to have a very close German-Polish cooperation. They have sympathy and even friendly feelings towards their neighbors in Germany. And Poles overwhelmingly would like to have close relations to German business. We all know that the German economic development is a major parameter also for the further development of our own economies in our region. So most people pin their hopes on a cooperation instead of being afraid of Germany. Given the reform of the judicial system in Poland, the European Commission has started Article 7 proceedings, and there's also judgment of the European Court of Judgment. Do we have to be concerned about the democratic development in Poland?
Well, when I spoke about the attempts to undermine the democratic institutions in my speech, I thought about what is happening with the Constitutional Court in Poland. Indeed, the Constitutional Court has been turned into a shell and a dummy of a constitutional court, and they robbed it of the independence. However, there's similar ideas with regard to the highest, the Supreme Court, has not been achieved by today's government. They were not successful. They try to undermine the independence of jurisdiction and the courts. However, the government did meet a strong opposition by the European institutions. So, in other words, the mechanism has proven its worth, where the European institutions, in these situations of the attempt of undermining the independence of jurisdiction in Poland, they put up a lot of resistance, the European institutions, to that. And I personally believe that there will be a time after the elections to address all of these issues and to straighten them out. This will be our task, our challenge. The democratic forces of Poland need to face those people in the opposition in Poland at the moment. But I am convinced that the lesson that the government got from the European institutions will not be without influence in the future. So before we open up the discussion, I mean, in your speech you mentioned the Christian roots of the Occident as core of Europe. So now, in the year that you were also you became president of Poland, 2010, Federal President Wolf said Islam belongs to Germany. Does Islam not also belong to Europe? Well, in Poland, we've got 2 Tatar villages and some mosques as well, but that is actually, with regard to the traditions, I believe that the sentence that Islam belongs to Germany, that it's part of reality, that is true. But this does not mean that Islam is part of the historical identity of Europe. Even though Islam is present and was present in Europe, but Europe was designed in contrast to Islam, both in the Iberian Peninsula as well as the Balkans. Those were areas where there were conflicts with Islam. So one should differentiate between what is the esteem and the respect of different citizens and the values. And we have to distinguish that from what we regard as tradition of the identity in Europe. So in Poland, we currently don't have any problems with people who come into the country and with larger numbers of people who are members of Islam, and we've got a good tradition of former Poles where there's Tatars that were resident in that area, and they were good sons of the Polish nation, and those were great soldiers who fought in the Polish armies for several centuries. They served well in the army, so there's a certain sentiment connected with that, and of course also with regard to Islam. So I could say without any problem that I also have Tatar blood and Lithuanian Germans and Ukrainian and also, thank goodness, also a little bit of Polish blood. So normally this statement would grab some interest. So Poland has got this traditional multinational, multicultural and multi-religious background, and today it is the case that we are looking at the past, and we had good experience in the past. So we've got 1,000 issues that we could continue to discuss on the stage, but due to the limited time, I would like to now take the questions from the audience. Over to you. So, President, you mentioned the Weimar Triangle, Germany, France, and Poland, and so 7 years ago, in February 2012, you had a historical Weimar summit. Mr. Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel, and that was the last summit of this nature. Then that it stopped. In Poland today, can you say that possibly the Visegrad group is higher and more important with regard to Polish interests towards the European Union? Well, for us, the Weimar Triangle was always something we always wanted to have and to promote. So this was a very important tool with which we were able to build our position in the integrated Europe. And on the other hand, this was a mechanism which involved us a lot into the problems of the integrating Europe, and this is still current. So, so that this triangle could work, there needs to be some honest commitment and strong commitment also of the Polish authorities in order to continue this and that it works well. So, but what happened here was, I would regard as a dramatically bad decision with regard to the foreign policy of this government that is in power in Poland, has been in power for just under 4 years. And I hope there's going to be a correction of this political line. I'm convinced of the fact that there must be a change. Even today, you can already see that today's government, you can see that they are aware of this failure. On the one hand, that this is about the cooperation with the UK. They decided to, and then they said they are going to leave the EU, and then they decided to have unilateral and unbalanced concept of founding the Polish foreign policy on the foundation with the relations with the United States. So the United States are going to be a very important country for Poland, especially because of the security issues. And with this security aspect for Poland and the entire region, but in such a situation where the policy of the United States of America actually signals it more often than not that there's a certain change, that they are more interested in Asia and they're not so interested in Europe anymore. And the Polish authorities are acting in a way that is unlogical to me and is something that I don't understand. So if someone, if you think of, or someone thinks that the security of Poland is important for them, and you have forged an alliance with the entire Western country, and then you cannot just go for one ally, the United States of America. You have to say European integration, we're part of Europe. And the Polish role was always to be at the side of these countries that were important for maintaining the deep cooperation between Europe and the States. And for Poland, this is actually unfortunate. So that the plans to forge the transatlantic alliance, this is a drama for Poland. I think that Poland itself has actually ditched the aspiration of being a balancing power in this relationship, and however, that's going to be retracted anyway. There's an old saying, and I hope that you have it in Germany as well, that so the church will be around for longer than the priest in the church. So the authorities are going to change, but the most important interests will remain within the framework of that. There is the close cooperation between Poland and Germany, but also the cooperation within the framework of the Weimar Triangle, because that is the guarantee for a balanced situation in Europe and a further development of Europe. So that was interesting, the church and the priest, and that reminds me of a famous quote in the State Secretary and Finance Minister said, regardless who is a minister, we will always play the ninth of Beethoven. Anyway, so we've got many questions. We're not going to be able to manage take them all, but I would suggest we'll gather 3 questions. You try to answer them in a compact way. The lady here, please. So I'm Christa Hemmerl. I come from Vienna, and I've been committed there for many years in women's and gender research, gender mainstreaming, and we work a lot with Polish colleagues, female colleagues of universities. And I wanted to ask, as you talked about European values, I think we agree very quickly that the gender mainstreaming, as it is favored by the European Union, that this is very important. And these colleagues, female colleagues from Poland, over the past decades, have been very committed, and also with the help of the European Union in part. So what I know of you is that over the past years you've been concerned of women's rights in Poland, and you had the big debate about abortion. I think that many took to the streets. So I just wanted to know what your assessment is with regard to women's rights in Poland. And yeah, so that is what I would like to follow up on. Thank you very much. So then over here, so Mr. Van Marshall first. Well, as you want. Elizabeth Brown in London, President. You mentioned the globalization, and you were a dissident, and you came out for reforms, and you also sacrificed. There's also other witnesses of the times, like Mr. Meckel is sitting in the first row here. The globalization's got and has led to big differences as well, so social differences, etc. So I would like to know how you regard globalization today, that brought along market economy, for which you also came out and which you advocated. So globalization, from your point of view, is that a danger for Poland, or is it also a danger for Europe? Mr. von Marschall. Christophe von Marschall, I work for the Tagesspiegel in Berlin. President, I would like to pick up on 2 points and want to bring together 2 points you talk about. You said about the youth. Well, it's actually just like the remainder of the European youth. You don't see any differences in the traditions and the attitudes toward the fatherland and so on. That's the one side. And then you said, you hinted at the fact that after the election in Poland, something could change in autumn in Poland, that the other side might have to straighten out things. That would mean that the other side would need to win the elections. Maybe you could bring the two together, because the last elections we had the problem too, that the younger people did not go to the booths, not as much, and then they were surprised why the results were not as younger generation might have wished for that. And maybe you also have to add that the Polish youth has not got the same international and idealist enthusiasm as the German youth, and maybe it's more national and more conservative. So I would like to know your views on this. Okay, gender mainstreaming, women rights, globalization, and young generation. Wide field of subjects. Well, maybe I'll start with young people, and I believe that so you are right to a certain extent, and so when you say that the young people in Poland and do embrace the conservative view of the world, but conservatism has got different names. So I'm also conservative, if you so will, but with regard to the approach to change in certain areas, for instance, respect the tradition. So the Polish conservatives have to conduct a revolution. So so my friends from the underground and Solidarność, they had to build capitalism and create capitalism. So the division with regard to these ideas that you see and perceive in Poland, they were deformed to a strong extent, and the stronger and more and the growing conservative attitude is very typical. But I think it's typical for the overall everywhere in Europe, not just Poland, but also Hungary. That's also happening in Germany. So when you look at the polls, you should look at the statistics. It's that needs to be considered, and I do see a certain danger there, and because of the rising concern with regard to whether this is possible to actually have the progress of European integration and to bring that together with this feeling of security and the national identity. So I personally think that the European Union is always a sum of national patriotism and not the counterpart. So I feel it that way, and I always doubted the fact that maybe that would be possible at some point to have the emergence of a European nation. No, I don't believe in that. So I don't think there will be a European nation, a European people. So I think the cultural cohesion may grow, but the memberships of Muslims, for instance, who come to Germany, they will they become Germans in their heart. They do not become Europeans or citizens of the world. They try to become Germans. That is, this might be longer or shorter, and this might be more successful or less successful, but still, these attitudes, you have to consider this, and this really needs to be considered with regard to the attitudes of young people in Poland. I see the danger of a deep polarization and radicalization, but on both sides. And so I have, so with regard to my opinions, I feel in the center of the political scene because there's a long way to an extreme fundamentalism or extremism and both right extremist and left extremist views. So what is the danger of Europe is the growing populism, and this is being built on a certain form of fundamentalism. That's the way it is with young people. With regard to women, so I thought that I always thought that the Polish women are good and feeling good, and there's something in this Polish tradition that you should remember, and I like to quote this often, and think also of the French, because the women only got the full citizenship at the end of the war in 1944, but in Poland this happened without any problems already in 1918 when the Polish state was founded. So automatically, if you say, well, the Polish women were especially committed in different national activities, and for us the problem of women's rights was something obvious. So without specific rules and regulations, Poland was the first post-communist country, and is probably the first country in Europe where there was a woman who became prime minister. This is Hanna Sochocka, and this is my colleague from my party, and so I think this just happened. So nobody needed to undertake any great activities to achieve this. So it was clear that we've got a good woman, and she should be a prime minister too. And I hope that also this is going to continue in the future. So the Poles, the Polish women were good also with different handling different attempts. So there was the announcements, for instance, to limit the abortion law, to restrict that law, and before that we had a political compromise that we arrived at beforehand, but due to the very decisive protests, which also involved a lot of women who represented different political opinions, there was the current government had to withdraw to a certain extent, and there was only small changes and amendments that were introduced. But with regard to the real activities, the actual activities in Poland, this that looks good. So the ladies are happy with their rights. Just a short answer, President, please. Okay, globalization. Okay, that has many different names, and so in earlier times it was the Americanization of culture, Americanization of politics. But now globalization is not a problem for Poland. We feel that. We don't regard it as a danger. Today, in Africa, globalization is the chance for an accelerated economic development to resolve the problems of poverty, and so some regard it as a danger, and as a danger with regard to uniformity. And you asked me how it was taken in Poland, but there's no emotions in Poland there.
Hier diskutieren können.
Well, we have so many topics we would like to discuss, but I cannot give you the chance to ask more questions since we have to finalize this session. One last question to you. The Queen of Belgium has a mother who was born as Countess Komorowski. You're a relative of hers. Do you still meet her? Are there any family reunions? That's a Polish specificity. We live everywhere in the world. And time and again we have our big family reunions, and it is a pleasure also to see all the Komorowskis coming from the US, UK, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Italy, wherever. That is to say, history has sometimes treated us brutally, but we are living well anyway. So it is by no means an accident that, we are like a yo-yo. You know how this works, this kind of toy. It's a ring on a string. You throw it down and it goes up again. It was something that I liked to play in my childhood a lot, and it reminds me of the Poles. You can marginalize us, you can push us to the ground, we always get up again. We always get back firmly on the ground. My cousin became Queen of Belgium, and there's also another family member of mine who became President of State in Poland. It does not only concern my family, but it's a typical thing for Poles at large. When you oppress us, we always find our way back. Maybe it's just our good genes that we have. I also would like to say thanks. Thanks a lot. Well, allow me to just mention two more things. First of all, allow me to thank you for the invitation to come here. Believe me, every opportunity to say something about a good German-Polish community, a community where fate unites us. That is something that I always want to emphasize. This is something that my generation succeeded in bringing about, the generation of the Solidarność people. They brought about this reconciliation with the neighbors, in particular with the Germans and the Ukraine. For us, every time we get a chance to say we want to build a good and robust relationship, that is an opportunity that we would use, and I would like to thank you for giving me that opportunity to talk about it.